Good morning. This is the Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission. It is December 21st, 9 a.m. We have a business agenda before us. We will start by taking a roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Ackerman?
Here.
Commissioner Cross?
Present.
Commissioner McGowan?
Here.
Commissioner Mesner?
Here.
Commissioner Oath?
Here.
Commissioner Ray? Commissioner Robbins?
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 6 out of 7 commissioners present today.
Great. Good to see everybody. We will move into our agenda. The first matter on our agenda is a update on the NOx rulemaking at the Air Pollution Control Division. Commissioner Oath, may I recognize you and or someone from your team?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. We do have members of our team from the Air Pollution Control Division, Leah Martland and Kate Fury, who are here today and going to provide an overview, and we're also certainly happy to answer questions. So Leah and Kate, I'm going to hand it over to you. Here's Leah.
Good morning, commissioners. I will babble silently for a moment until my sound comes up. It's a weird thing with a new computer. I don't know how to fix it. It takes a few seconds for there to be audio. So hopefully you can hear me now. All right, good. Thank you for inviting us to give an update. It's been a while since I have provided that update, so nice to see you all. I did send Angelica some slides. I don't know if you can bring those up and flip forward for me. That would be great.
You can give me one moment, please.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay.
Maybe while that's coming up, Mr. Chair, I'll just take the opportunity to set the table a little bit, and really excited to be able to talk about this today. As you all know, the Governor Polis has tasked us to work together on making some really significant NOx reductions from the oil and gas sector, and so this is a huge first step in that regard, delivering on that in less than a year, and then more to come in the ongoing work next year as well. So really excited to go through the details.
We like to do things in December and make it excessively busy. And I had optimistic hope for next year that we wouldn't, but we will. Great, thank you so much. All right. So again, my name is Leah Martland. I'm in the Planning and Policy Program at the Air Division in Regulatory Development specifically, and providing an update on as Tricia mentioned, the rulemaking that we just had last month, and then to recap on some other ongoing efforts to reduce emissions from the oil and gas sector. There's a lot, and so certainly if you have questions about anything that I don't spend a whole lot of time on, we're definitely happy to circle back on that. Next slide, please. So these are the 3 areas that I wanted to focus on. The NOx intensity is our new one, and then a bit of a refresher on the greenhouse gas intensity and midstream CO2e reduction efforts. These are a little more unique than some of our direct regulations, where we look at equipment specific or a particular operation, and these 3 rules are all looking at reductions from the segments. Next slide, please. So last week was a busy week. We had a 3-day rulemaking with public comment starting on Tuesday. So I guess it's 4 days, 3 and a few hours. There was a lot of interest in various elements that we have proposed to the commission. A very important one that I just want to mention was the approval of our severe ozone SIP, our state implementation plan. We have 2 standards that we are working to achieve, and the 2008 standard is what this SIP related to, and we are modeling an attainment demonstration the year for both of the standards, 2008, and the 2015 more stringent National Ambient Air Quality Standard is 2027. So we'll look at the 3 years of data prior to then, and so that was a big point that I just wanted to highlight. A lot of work went into that with division staff and Regional Air Quality Council staff. And so we're happy to be sending that to EPA next year after the legislative review session. The other revisions I wanted to focus on here, lots of pieces to different things, but the ones that I wanted to focus on were revisions adopted to regulation number 7 and regulation number 26. Earlier this year, we split apart regulation 7. It had gotten a bit beastly, and so the requirements in regulation 26 were in 27 and now have been split out for ease. And so if you're looking at historic versions, you'll see them combined. but they are now in separate regulations. So we adopted state-only requirements. So while they are designed, amongst other things, to achieve reductions in ozone precursor emissions, they were not being proposed to be included in the SIP at this time. A small nuance, perhaps, but an important one. Next slide, please. So as Tricia mentioned, the governor directed ECMC and CDPHE to achieve reductions in NOx during the summer months. Technically, our ozone season is year-round as we monitor ozone season, but we see our highest values in the summer. And so we'll often call our ozone season in reflecting the summer months of May through September, although primarily the higher values are seen in July through August, but we do see some outlier higher values in the May and September months bordering the summer. So the governor directed us collectively to look at the 2017 baseline, which was used in the SIP related to the 2008 standard. I'm going to take back some of the details. That's probably too much information as to how these baselines get set and how they are different baselines for the two SIPs. But it was specific to look at this baseline and achieve a 30% reduction in 25 and then a 50% reduction in 2030. So we evaluated that baseline against those percent reductions to determine what the target reductions needed to be. We do have it here as a tons per day and a tons per season, and this is averaged across the whole season. And I just want to make that point because we use these tons per day values and these tons per season values as planning values. And so this is not saying that we needed to develop a strategy to achieve this every single day, but looking at this reduction over a season. Next slide, please. Thank you. So again, in a little bit more finite detail, again, this is the tons per day. This is taking those values and splitting it across the season to see where we can achieve reductions. And we use this not just for oil and gas, but in looking at other segments of our ozone precursor emissions. So we highlighted here in red. These are some slides that we shared with the Air Commission as well. And so they're fairly familiar with how the planning works with looking at tons per day. But we wanted to share with you because these are the areas in red where we see higher NOx emissions from the breakdown in pre-production and production. So we proposed the NOx intensity and some direct regulations to achieve reductions. And we've estimated those here, looking at, again, taking the segment season value and then breaking it apart. So we'll achieve these reductions are estimated over the season, but if for planning purposes, again, looking at a tons per day, achieving reductions in drilling and completion operations, NOx emissions, as well as engine NOx emissions. And I'll get to those in more detail here shortly. So next slide, please. For regulation number 7, we had proposed and the commission adopted with a few revisions, direct regulations on drilling and completion operations. So we have use practices. These are similar to the BMPs that you all look at in that we have a list of options. So in the summer months of May through September, starting next year, even though the governor's letter directive was for 25, we are starting to see some of those reductions going into that 25 and then further into 26. Again, that is important for ozone attainment demonstration as we look at the 3-year average for the design value under ozone. And so getting those earlier reductions in 24 was important to us. So we are looking at use practices, and I'll get to those in a little more detail here, as well as this NOx intensity target for the upstream segment. So looking at not only drilling and pre-production, but also production facilities and their NOx emissions and achieving reductions there. And we had also proposed to, excuse me, the Air Quality Control Commission, a second phase to achieve that later, a more stringent reduction of 50% by 2030, a joint steering committee. And I believe you're somewhat familiar with this as these in going into the rulemaking, having these discussions about how we get there for that later target. This wasn't included in the rule of the steering committee itself as a regulatory directive, but we did include some discussion in the statement of basis and purpose for regulation number 7, explaining how the rules that were adopted just last week will start making progress and then achieve the first goal, and then how we will continue to work forward to achieve that second goal. Next slide, please. So these are the use practices that we had proposed and the commission adopted. They are for use practices for drilling operations and then for completion operations, because while some of the equipment is the same, some is different. And then we further proposed to provide some more stringent and protective use practices for operations located in a cumulatively impacted community. So that's the CIC there. And that is a portion of communities in a disproportionately impacted community, which I know you're very familiar with as well, that statutory definition, and looking at where the environmental burdens are greater. And that's how we defined a cumulatively impacted community. So beginning next year, next summer, drilling operations in communities, CICs and non-CICs have to use these use practices here. They are designed to achieve NOx reductions in comparison to what we understood in 2017, the primary equipment being more the tier 2 diesel engines. And so that's how we evaluated which use practices should be listed here, but also recognizing that there are other equipment and opportunities that continue to be developed. This industry is fairly innovative, and so we did include an option for other technology, but it has to be approved by the division. And then for completion operations, similarly including the lower emitting or non-emitting NOx options to conduct those operations. Next slide, please. So the other piece that was adopted in Regulation 7 for the upstream segment, and instead of limiting that to just production and pre-production, or just to pre-production NOx, we're also including the production NOx. So achieving NOx reductions on a company basis, and that's where these targets are set. So we're looking at in the most simplistic way, NOx emissions over production, and then that's where the intensity are set. If you go to the next slide, please, it explains the formula a little bit more, and I'll talk a little bit about how we came up with this number and what it means. So again, simplistically, it's NOx emissions over thousands of barrels of oil equivalent, KBOE. Specifically, it's the NOx emitted during the summer, because that's the directive to reduce that NOx, and then looking at a portion of annual production, recognizing that if drilling and completions happen in the summer, that production may not occur during the summer. And so we will ultimately determine compliance by looking at the NOx in the summer over 5/12 of annual production. In seeing where production was going so that we could set those future targets, we looked at our production data and your production data. And anytime you make a projection into the future, there's always some uncertainty. But looking at the recent few years, and we do go into more detail on this if you're interested in our supporting documents that were provided with the rulemaking. But we included a 5% growth rate for production, recognizing again where production has been at with some oddness around COVID, but recognizing where it does continue to grow. And this is looking at specifically production in the non-attainment area, so not statewide production, because we are looking at specifically non-attainment area NOx reductions. So we calculated out a projected production rate, and then looked at what reductions that we needed to achieve. And that was that earlier slide with the overall season NOx as compared to 2017, and developed 3 targets looking at a 20% reduction in 24 to start getting to the 30% reduction in 25, and then carrying that forward into 26, the 30% reduction, to help continue to make progress while we develop strategies to achieve the 50% reduction. And then from there, so that's the sector-wide intensity targets. From there, we looked at establishing majority operator and minority operator targets to reflect the greater opportunity to reduce NOx emissions with the operators that have greater production. They have more facilities, there's more opportunity there. And looking at the majority minority split, we looked at, again, in the non-attainment area production, 50,000 tons KBOE. This is slightly different than the majority threshold established for the upstream program, which you may be familiar with, and I'll get to in later slides as well. But looking at that break between majority and minority, the majority operators reflect approximately 86% of the oil and gas production in the ozone non-attainment area. And we also have within the minority target a lower threshold for defining that minority operator of 45 KBOE. And so under that, what we had initially called de minimis are operators that are responsible for less than 1% of the production and less than 1% of the NOx. And so while those operators will be subject to the direct regulations, the use practices, and they won't be subject to the NOx intensity, but that is something that will certainly be open for discussion as to how to look at the complete segment and working towards that later 50% reduction. Next slide, please. So to determine compliance, we will be relying on information that's reported through our oil and natural gas annual emissions inventory report, which we lovingly call ONGAR. You can't have rules without more acronyms, but recognizing that we don't get that information until the summer after the year of emissions, we did also propose and have adopted some interim reporting to help us evaluate compliance with those initial intensity targets. And those reports will be submitted to the division in, excuse me, in November. So starting in November of next year, collecting information on the facilities that are active in the summer, and then interim reporting of their NOx and production. So we will be able to use that to see where the operators are at, where the segment is at, and also be able to use that information to start informing next steps, again, towards that 50% goal, but then looking at the QA/QC data that will come in with the ONGAR reports to ultimately determine compliance on an operator basis. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we had included discussion in our rulemaking about a NOx reduction steering committee. We have been working with y'all and will continue to do so to figure out how to get to that next step of the 50% reduction. We didn't want to presuppose where this NOx steering committee will go. So while we do have some topics that we recommended to be considered, those were included to help parties and the Air Commission understand how we were envisioning this going forward. And so we listed a few of them here, but certainly that is not limiting or, again, presupposing what the outcomes of that steering committee will be. Next slide, please. And then in regulation number 26, we proposed some additional engine standards, NOx limits for engines. This is proposed statewide, so it's not focused solely on the non-attainment area, and it also includes emission limits for diesel or dual fuel engines, which are not oil and gas segment specific. We actually don't frame out the natural gas fired engine requirements as specific to this industry, as others can use those emissions as well, but that is where we see the bulk of them is in that segment of operations. So we built this off of what we call our large engine rule that was adopted in 2020 for greater than 1,000 horsepower natural gas fired engines, and included additional engines for those 1,000 horsepower engines, increasing the stringency of the NOx limit for lean burn engines, but then also looked at the next segment of engines. So we included emission limits for rich burn and lean burn engines, greater than 100 horsepower, but less than 1,000 horsepower. And again, modeling it off of the 1,000 horsepower engine rule, have portions of compliance that will need to be achieved starting in 2025 and phasing in through 2029, allowing operators to start making those any needed reduction improvements, retrofits, engine replacements, planning purposes, and start achieving reductions, but not have everything come all at once. So those will be, again, phased in over that time period. For the diesel and dual fuel engines, it's a little different universe of engines, and often these fleets may only include one engine. We see these more with backup generators. We had some slightly different timeframes for phasing it in and having that compliance begin in 27 through 29. And there are a few exemptions for emergency engines and engines under certain fuel usage, but we do anticipate seeing some statewide reductions in NOx that will also help in the non-attainment area for engines located there. Before I jump into a refresher on the upstream greenhouse gas and midstream CO2 rules that we are adopted and implementing, I did just want to note that, so I'm finding my notes here, that there was interest from parties looking at, in this segment, additional reduction opportunities, and while the commission didn't include any specific directives on timelines to address those, we do see additional strategy development going into next year that may result in rulemakings next year or in the year after, related to EPA's new source performance standards and their emission guidelines. That one has a pre-publication version out, so it does not yet have an effective date, but there will be timelines for which states have to submit their emission guideline 111D plans, as well as continuing to look at engines, particularly the under 100 horsepower engines. So we may have additional discussions, and certainly we'll look for your input related to those particular areas of the upstream segment as we continue to develop them. All right, so greenhouse gas intensity and CO2e reduction were rules that were adopted in 2021 in response primarily, but not solely, to directives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions statewide. You can see the percentage goals and years listed here, as well as more specifically percent reductions for oil and gas sector. And those compared to, we're going to throw in more baseline. So we have a 2017 baseline for ozone NOx, but for the greenhouse gas, we're looking at 2005 and 2015 and achieving percent reductions there. Before I really jump into the greenhouse gas intensity and CO2e reduction, do you want to note that this rulemaking also included direct regulations, quite a bit of new and expanded requirements. So we proposed, and the commission had adopted, ECD testing requirements, enclosed combustion device testing, control requirements for existing separators. We increased the leak detection and repair inspection frequencies for well production facilities and natural gas compressor stations, expanded natural gas processing plant LDAR statewide. It was previously only in the non-attainment area. Gas plant rod packing replacements for reciprocating compressors, expanded pneumatic controller requirements, well maintenance requirements, new requirements for midstream pigging and blowdown, capture and control requirements, and annual reporting refinement. So again, there's a lot. If you have questions on that, certainly can come back to it, but just wanted to note that this rulemaking that we'll go into more on the next slide, please, included more than just the intensity and CO2e programs. So to build these programs, we had to see where we were starting at and where we were going to, specific to the percent reductions, and these are listed out here. We did look at the greenhouse gas roadmap in developing, flip through to my notes, and developing these baselines and then the directives in the statute for the percent reductions that we needed to get to. And a lot of this information was pulled from the slides that were presented in that rulemaking, and I have some links at the very end should you want to go back and see some more information about those. Next slide, please. So this rule required greenhouse gas reductions from pre-production and production operations. Similar to the NOx intensity that we just went through, there are majority operator and minority operator intensity targets. And those are looking at targets in 25, 27, 2030. So it's not that you achieve that target and then you don't have to do anything. Those targets carry forward. It's just those are the years where they increase in stringency. And then also looking at new facility greenhouse gas intensity targets in 23, 28, and 2030 with more stringent targets for the facilities that are located in the ozone non-attainment area and in a disproportionately impacted community. The rule requires operators to submit greenhouse gas intensity plans. They submitted those this year, and then there are periodic updates in 26 and 28, as well as if an operator is not meeting their required intensity target. And then the compliance determined through annual verifications in 24 through 2031. And we did have a rulemaking on intensity verification, which I'll get to here shortly, that further refined how operators will demonstrate compliance with their intensity targets. Next slide, please. So similar to NOx intensity, this program is total emissions over total production. A difference between NOx intensity and greenhouse gas intensity is that greenhouse gas intensity looks at the statewide production, whereas NOx intensity is focused on non-attainment area. So looking at the production and pre-production greenhouse gas emissions per company over, again, KBOE determines the company's intensity. So we looked at the production data that was reported to EPA under the greenhouse gas reporting rule, and initially in developing the proposal, and there was a wide range of greenhouse gas intensities. Looking at our reported data, which in 2021 was the first year for the annual reporting that was adopted in 2020, and has been refined over time. And so looking at all of the data that we could find, looking at the projections in the greenhouse gas roadmap, and again, on the earlier slide showing where we needed to get to, we developed the intensities by looking at what portion of the 2005 for upstream, what portion of the 2005 baseline emissions for the oil and gas sector could be attributed to upstream, and then determined what reduction needed to be achieved out of that portion to get to the reduction goals for the specific years that were specified. And looking at the split between upstream and midstream, the greenhouse gas roadmap inventories, while well developed and also continue to be refined. Hopefully you've seen some of the presentations about the greenhouse gas roadmap updates that are ongoing right now. Division staff presented the challenges and the improvements very well in those presentations. So I'll certainly encourage anyone to take a look at those recordings and the reports. The roadmap lumps emissions. And so to see where we needed to get the reductions from the segments as they were split, particularly with the industrial segment, we came up with upstream, midstream percentage portions. And so allocating those percentages to the baselines to see what specific reductions we needed to get to in those future years over, again, projected production was how we came up with the intensity targets. And again, I didn't include a slide here listing them all out because there are several years worth, and they're majority and minority operators, as well as the new facility targets, but we have a link to the rules at the end of the slide, and you can certainly take a look at those. A lot of information, a lot of detail. Certainly come back to that to try to answer questions if you have them. So upstream intensity verification. We had an additional rulemaking this year. It was a consensus proposal, which we always work hard to achieve, and certainly want to give a shout out to Steph Rucker and her team and shepherding this one through the commission. It's a complicated topic, verifying the bottom up, top down inventories, and how do you understand emissions that may not necessarily be as well known through emission factor calculations. So there's two approaches to the verification. Operators will demonstrate compliance either using a state default intensity verification factor or an operator specific program. And work is ongoing right now to develop the verification protocol. We have our next meeting in January. I included the link here. That protocol will include the measurement strategies being developed for the 25-26 years, should an operator want a specific program. And then in beginning in 27, an operator can use an operator developed program, but that does have to be approved by the division. So these strategies will define how direct measurement and parametric measurement informs reporting of emissions. It does require a third-party auditor review that inventory as submitted through our OnGAR system. And we will start seeing those coming in here shortly as operators start meeting those initial targets. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, also adopted in 2021 was a midstream CO2e reduction. This is where the complicated break apart came from the industrial segment emissions baseline, which is 2015, and allocating emissions from this segment as combined. So some complicated analysis and in parsing that apart. But this program requires midstream segment operators to submit company emission reduction plans, ERP plans, to a midstream steering committee. So this work has been ongoing for the past 2 years, and definitely want to recognize the hard work of Andy Gruhl, who's been leading that effort. The Midstream Steering Committee developed a number of things to help the midstream operators develop their ERP plans, and their work is ongoing right now with the Midstream Steering Committee to develop recommendations for a segment ERP. Then that recommendation will go to the division in March, and the division, then there will be some additional public opportunities for review and feedback on those recommendations, and the division will develop a proposal that is calendared to go to the Air Quality Control Commission in August, with a hearing, if granted, in December, that will establish how this segment will achieve the overall segment % reduction, and have some more specific details for specific facilities and operators. And so all of that is continuing to be developed. Certainly encourage you all to go to the Midstream Steering Committee page to see more information on the work that's ongoing there. I've included that link here at the bottom as well. Okay, I think my second to last slide is the links I keep mentioning, the December 2023 rulemaking documents that have the iterations of the rule. The Commission did adopt a few refinements to Regulation 7 and Regulation 26, and so the versions that you can find in the folders on that website include the latest proposals that we provided to the Commission. The final version that was adopted will be available after it goes through the Commission's and the Attorney General's review process. So can share some of the information and the discussion, but the versions that you'll find here, I'm just trying to say, are not fully reflective of what the Commission adopted, as they don't include the revisions that the Commission adopted in the hearing itself. And then the folders for the upstream greenhouse gas intensity and CO2e reduction rules and the verification rulemaking, as well as a link to the QCC regulations. And then any questions? I will try my best to answer them, as long as you don't ask specific questions about the math.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the presentation. Commissioners, questions? Commissioner McGowan?
Good morning. Thanks for spending your morning with us. I know it's tough. We're heading into the holidays and you all just finished an intense rulemaking, so I appreciate you getting us caught up. And I want to say that I have appreciated, sorry, my dogs are making some noise in the background. I appreciate that our staff has been trying to work together to figure out how we're going to incorporate the rulemaking that you all have been going through into some of our decision-making processes as we review oil and gas permits. So I think that there's a really good opportunity for us to have kind of some processes that work with each other as we're making decisions and trying to reach these goals. And for the NOx rulemaking, some of the feedback that we've gotten so far from stakeholders is, I will use, I guess, the word critique and why we're using an intensity target for NOx instead of a per ton day limit during the ozone season. And I think in particular that 31.7 ton per day number has been thrown out to the commission. And I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit the thought process with the commission and with staff on why the intensity target is an appropriate measure to use, and the pros and the cons versus a ton per day cap. Because I'm going to guess that it's going to come up with us.
Sure. So I haven't been involved in all your conversations, so I'd certainly ask Kate to jump in with her perspective as well. The 31 season tons reduction over the season is averaged across those months, right? So as I was trying to talk about how we use these inventories for planning purposes, seeing where the opportunities are, what sort of reductions can be achieved. And we have breakdowns of the different segments that we've looked at in addition to oil and gas. And so you can see where some opportunities are with other segments of emissions in the non-attainment area. And that's for ozone planning specifically, although you could certainly use a similar approach looking across the state for greenhouse gases emission reductions as well. So it's an average value that we need to achieve. As you all are probably more familiar than I am, the operations fluctuate day to day. And we did actually look at initially with some of our earlier stakeholder outreach and strategy evaluations, looking at a limit on we were calling it a daily mass limit for drilling and completion operations. And that was very challenging in trying to figure out how we would establish that, because there are differences with these operations that make that appropriate, but not. Because you can't bucket all of the various differences in a way to do a per day or a per well limit is what we found in the end. So we pivoted a bit and started looking at NOx intensity, which again is more of an averaging type of approach and allows for reductions to be evaluated most cost effectively for an operator's particular operations, and then averaging that out again. So the operators will be able to see where their opportunities for reductions are from the facilities that are in the non-attainment area, and seeing where they can achieve those day to day, but across the summer, and then averaging that, and then looking at that over the annual production that I mentioned on a different slide. You know, we heard from parties and stakeholders as well about trying to put a cap on emissions. Certainly that impacts production, which has its own challenges, in trying to look at, and with the variability in the operations, trying to establish that in an enforceable and cost-effective way, it was not the approach that we took. And so that's a really long babble. I'm going to see if Kate has something to add.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with that one, Leah. I think the problem that we have repeatedly run into when we come up, or when the idea of like a hard daily cap is proposed, or a, you know, overall production limit is proposed, is how do you equitably and fairly allocate that cap? You know, how do you say which operators are able to drill on what days, and what operations they're able to do on what days, to stay within a hard cap of, you know, 30-ish tons per day? Or if you have a production cap, how do you allocate it? Is it first come, first serve? Is it, you know, each company gets a certain percentage? And we've yet to really hear a good solution to that. And of course, we're open to continuing those discussions. And if groups have good ideas as to how to fairly do that, we're certainly open to hearing about it. We feel, and I believe that, the majority of stakeholders could perhaps come to agreement about this, that allowing operators to determine for themselves within the overall company-wide cap is the most efficient way to allow continued innovation moving forward in a sector, as you all know, that advances very quickly. Instead of us dictating what technology they should use, to allow them to develop processes to where if they wanted to increase production at the same time, they would have to be reducing their overall NOx emissions. And we feel that this approach is the best way to achieve those results.
Thank you. And it's a really good segue into my thought about in the NOx rule. I think what we're saying is during the high ozone season, there will be either limitations for what types of equipment you will be able to use during the ozone season. Otherwise, you need to do your drilling and completions activity outside the ozone season, I think is what I'm hearing. And then in addition, if you're in a cumulatively impacted community, there will be even more kind of restrictive requirements. Do you envision that those would be a part of the CDPHE consultation as part of our OGDP review process, so that we would know that those types of limitations are linked to the ozone regulation as we're reviewing an OGDP if they're proposing drilling or completions during the ozone season?
So yes, that is how the rule structure is set up. And then I'll ask Kate again to talk a little bit more about the consultation process. So we don't say specifically which out of the list of options, but it is a limited list of options. So there's some flexibility there for operators to choose what's available. And one of the reasons that we included some more reductive and NOx reducing measures for the cumulatively impacted community list is recognizing that while we certainly want to encourage the lower emitting or non-emitting equipment, that it has some limited availability right now. And so that is one of the reasons why we prioritize some of that for those communities for these initial years of this program. Just a little aside.
And I would never presume to speak for Tessa. However, I would say that, our approach to the consultation process and to BMPs in general has been to ask for the most significant emissions reductions that we can. And so there are at times where the BMPs will appear to be redundant because we already have regulations within the non-attainment area within specific to a CIC. However, we will ask all operators statewide to agree to those BMPs as well.
I'm looking forward to that discussion in our cumulative impacts rulemaking and how we can work with each other and make sure that our processes are linked and that we're helping you all, helping us help us and to achieve those goals. So I'm looking forward to that discussion. Does the intensity target for the 2025 goal, which I understand actually has a 2026 goal attached to it, is it going to sunset in 2026? Or is the steering committee going to have a discussion about, okay, this looks like it's working, but we need even more to get to the 2030 goal? So that might continue to exist. And the steering committee says, but we'll have to add these other things. I'm curious to know, because it seems like a lot of work for something that's just going to go away in 2026. So
yes, the NOx intensity targets are currently only established for 24, 25, and 26. And that was one of the things that we flagged. Again, I don't want to presuppose where the NOx steering committee goes, but that is something that we flagged that could be considered, is continuing a NOx intensity program or evaluating those targets. But there's, some brilliant minds, I'm sure, are going to be pondering on how to get to that 50% reduction. And so that's an option. But we did not say that it has to carry forward, but it is something that we thought should be considered.
Great. And then I just wanted to clarify for folks that are listening, I think that ECMC has a seat on the steering committee so that we can continue to work with each other and understand how our processes can work together.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks.
Great questions and great answers. Thank you for all that. Further questions for the panel? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time to come share this with us, and all the work that has gone into developing this, both recently and in the past. So, Commissioner McGowan asked some of the questions that I'm curious about, and I really am interested in the applicability and the timing of how some of these intensity pieces communicate with our OGDP process in particular. I understand that there's existing pieces, existing activities that occur that, you know, could apply as well. But, you know, as we're reviewing OGDPs and better understanding what our expectations should be from operators, different equipment and different technologies, I think the work that that's currently ongoing to try to figure out how to better tie the two processes together ends up being really critical. And in my review of applications, and in particular applying the rules that are currently you know, in our process, as well as, you know, contemplating cumulative impacts rulemaking that's upcoming as well. I did have a few just general questions to make sure I better understand the processes that you just went through. So for the recent NOx intensity rulemaking, like, what is the time frame for applicability? I mean, is it implemented as of today? Is it implemented, you know, as of some date in the future? What happens to pending permits, and how does that directly communicate with our process, you know, over the next couple of months as we look at OGDPs?
So the rule was just adopted, and it has a Secretary of State process that it has to go through. So, you know, it will be effective mid-February, but the requirements themselves will start applying in 2024. So what operators will have to do is to reduce their summertime NOx emissions to achieve this intensity target. And then, as I mentioned, we'll start seeing some of that initial data coming in November, to see, you know, to begin evaluating where operators are at. And then the use practices similarly. So if wells are drilled or completed after May 1 of 2024, between May and September, then they'll have to use the use practices that are limited. So that's the timing of when those provisions will occur and start implementing. And then it'll be the same timing for 25 and 26, that those practices apply in the summer in the non-attainment area, and reductions have to be achieved in the summer in the non-attainment area so as to be able to demonstrate compliance with the NOx intensities. I'm not as familiar with your permitting process and how your permits are evaluated, and the where they sit, and how you can consider them for implementing requirements. But going forward, we certainly see operators need to achieve reductions to achieve the NOx intensity and to comply with the use practices as being something that they would be reflecting in the information that they submit to you all. But Kate, I don't know if you have something to add there as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Commissioner Messner. I think that really ties into the kind of the whole reason why we're here today, right? Is to think about, even though our regulations were developed independent of your process, because we certainly can't predetermine what the outcome of your cumulative impacts rulemaking will be, I do see some opportunities for improvements or changes to the OGDP process, specifically around the 2Bs, right? So getting a better idea of when the emissions that are submitted, the emissions estimates that are submitted to you all through the 2Bs and through the OGDPs are actually going to be realized. So, you know, the current process is they file the OGDP, gets approved, and they can drill anytime within the next 3 years, right? If we had a better idea of when those emissions were actually going to be realized, that would be helpful. The true benefit of your process to our process is you all can give us a front looking, like a prediction of what's going to happen in over a certain time frame, whereas our tools are almost all backward looking, right? So in addition to the emissions estimates on a 2B, it would be also helpful to have kind of forward looking production estimates. One of the key criticisms of this intensity approach is that if production takes off and exceeds that 5% target that we built in, that's going to allow operators to increase their NOx emissions instead of decreasing them, right? So having a heads up or an idea from ECMC and from the OGDPs that are being submitted that production is taking off will allow us time to adjust those emissions factors downward to try to make sure that we're still capturing the NOx decreases, even if production increases beyond the 5% growth target that we've estimated. And that's just kind of two ideas off the top of my head as to how we could kind of incorporate these processes closer together to get frontward looking information from you all, and then use the backward confirmation from us to make sure that we have a true identification of what's actually going on in the oil fields.
Okay, that's helpful. I'll also note that in our current review process, and it's certainly informed by the CDPHE consultation, as well as operator provided information on how they're going to evaluate and address cumulative impacts associated with information provided on the Form 2B and other relevant information. And so I think it's even an opportunity for our processes to better coordinate with one another through the consultation process to look at what some of these intensity targets are and make recommendations within the consultation on how the operator is or is not clearly meeting their requirements associated with their cumulative impacts plan, and whether or not the evaluation of current information on the Form 2B may or may not ultimately, I guess, pass the sniff test as to whether or not they're going to meet their intensity requirements moving forward. And so I agree. I think that the cumulative impact rulemaking certainly has opportunities to evaluate and refine processes. I think we currently have processes in place to also evaluate and address some of this stuff and incorporate some of the rulemakings that have been developed through that consultation process. And so really appreciate that. So this is going to be just so in-use requirements. I mean, it seems like the only technologies that's missing there is just a straight tier 2 diesel engine or below, right? I mean, so there's lots of technologies in that are available to operators. How do they make that determination? I mean, if they use all like the most emitting technologies that are in those in-use requirements, and I'm not suggesting that operators would do this, but I'm just trying to understand how you would apply it. So understanding that you've got kind of a hierarchy of equipment that's being proposed in the in-use requirements, and if an operator comes in and says, I'm only able to use everything at the bottom of that list that has the most emissions, how does that work? Or do they have to like kind of quantify and qualify how it meets their intensity standards? I'm just trying to better understand how that list gets applied.
Sure. So as part of our initial reporting, operators will have to say how they've complied with those in-use practices. And so we do think we're going to get some more precise information about what equipment is available and what operators are using. And really starting in 2024 is to encourage the drilling and frac rigs that we want to see to come here and stay here with that lower emitting equipment. The operators will have to calculate what their emissions are from the equipment that they select, unless out of those lists, unless they get something else approved by the division as part of their NOx intensity and reporting. And so while we do provide the flexibility for a variety of options, where an operator is at in their summer NOx may inform the choices that they select, right? Because if they're going to they have their current existing production operations, for example, and their new NOx emissions from the summer is going to be a new drilling or fracking operation, and seeing what their understanding of their production is and what reductions they need to achieve, may dictate which choice that they select out of that list, amongst other things, including your all's process, as well as, there's some local requirements too that I'm sure that will factor in depending on the location. So that might be a piece of it. Equipment availability, like I mentioned earlier, as we understand, we certainly hope and optimistically anticipate that this equipment will move and stay in Colorado and continue to get better and innovate for additional reductions. May also change the future choices in 25 and 26 more so than in 24. I mean, this is, months away, right, that this has to be implemented. And so while we, certainly would like to say no NOx at all, that's it wasn't feasible. How do you do that in 6 months? And so that was one of the reasons that we considered for the longer list of potential equipment that can be used. I think that, again, looking at what equipment was part of the inventory from 2017, we've seen that equipment already coming in and being used. Y'all are familiar with what you've seen the operators come in and suggest to be used. So it was evaluating in the list where we can see reductions based on the equipment that we saw in 2017. That's another piece that I wanted to highlight as to what equipment was included in the list. I'm not sure if that actually answers your question.
That's okay. It's complicated, and I get it. I guess in my mind, I had assumed that they do need to meet whatever their intensity standards are, and they may choose from these different pieces of equipment, but what they choose is going to inform ultimately whether or not they meet that intensity standard. And I understand that. I'm just trying to figure out how we would know that at the permitting stage, as they're making decisions on equipment, and how the two processes can better communicate with one another, because it seems problematic to have them determine a certain equipment in our process and then have to modify it in your process. And I would argue that in our rules, that modification may or may not create a significant change to an OGDP application that may require additional review.
I weigh in on that real quick, Commissioner Messner, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. I'm thinking aloud here too, so just understand that as I'm hearing information. So
I think the intent of the in-use restrictions, particularly when it is in a CIC, is to get that high polluting equipment out of CIC operations specifically. So those cases will be a little bit easier, well, they will be easier for the commission to see, because that will be determined during the BMP consultation process, because every operation that's going to occur in a CIC will go through, well, I shouldn't say every, but almost all of them, unless they're in a non-populated area, will probably go through a consultation process in which, all this equipment will be asked for. And the fact that it's going to be required in our rules will kind of take some of the operator choice away during the consultation process, because they know that through our process, they're going to have to use certain pieces of equipment and not just what we suggest through the BMP. So the other thing too is that the operators could also be required to demonstrate that their proposed equipment complies with the intensity target as part of the OGDP. That could be something that happens, but certainly that's on up to you all to decide. I do think it would be difficult for an operator to at the time that they're going through the OGDP process, not commit to using the same equipment that they would have to use during our process. Although theoretically that would be possible. I think it's very, very, very unlikely in a CIC. In a non-CIC, you might see a little bit of that if like maybe equipment availability is different. But I would hope that they would choose very similar emissions efficiency or efficient equipment when it comes to the engines, even if it's a slightly different technology.
Okay, that's super helpful and helps me better understand it. And I'm sure additional revisions or thoughts on that will occur through that continual coordination between our agencies. Sorry, I'm just like looking at my notes 1 second to figure out what Commissioner McGowan asked and what she didn't. So oh, I have one here that I was curious about. So when we talk about Reg 26 or not Reg 26, but the greenhouse gas intensity rulemaking, and understanding it was done a couple of years ago, but I'm trying to remember now. Well, pre-production I think is included, but does that pre-production include the non-stationary engines and the trucking associated with pre-production, in those reduction requirements or not?
So the greenhouse gas intensity does apply to production and pre-production. It's looking at
or sorry, I didn't mean non-stationary. I meant stationary engines.
the stationary engines.
Yeah.
So yes, they certainly could look at reductions there. It's they're going to have to evaluate all of their methane emissions. So you do see methane emissions from combustion equipment, but it's more so focused on the non-combustion equipment. So it'll be part of it, but where we're going to see more of the reductions from the combustion equipment is in the midstream CO2e reduction, which is really focusing on their combustion equipment. So the stationary engine requirements in Reg 26 now, and I should say that the upstream and midstream rules used to be in Reg 22, and they like to make things complicated and move them around. They're now in Reg 7. So if you hear references to the Reg 22 upstream rule, it's now with the other oil and gas requirements in Reg 7. So the engine rules are kind of a layer on top of those efforts. They are standalone requirements, but again, the upstream greenhouse gas rule is looking at methane intensities, and then the midstream rule is looking at CO2e reductions from really the combustion equipment.
Okay, thanks. And last question, and back to the NOx rulemaking. There's classifications for different operators as part of that. And how do we know what the classifications are? I mean, would that be a part of that consultation as well, just so that we have an idea in our process, what classification this particular operator is? And because I think that informs ultimately what their kind of intensity target is, right?
It does, right. So we looked at our on-gear data to determine where those splits are, and I look at Tricia and Kate. I see no reason why we couldn't provide that data to you, so you'd know who fell in what bucket.
Great. Thank you again for being here. Thank you for answering my questions. I'm still learning a lot about this process, and so it was super helpful. So thank you.
Welcome.
Questions? Thanks for being here and answering. Any further questions for the panel? Well, seeing no further questions, I do note that the PowerPoint is in our portfolio. We'll make sure that it's available to our stakeholders if there are questions. Really appreciate you guys being with us this morning, and look forward to continued cooperation into 2024 and beyond. All right, commissioners, that concludes the business on our agenda for today. And I do believe that concludes our public-facing work for 2024. Been a heck of a year. Really proud of all the accomplishments. And we want to wish everybody happy holidays with a motion to adjourn. So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We're adjourned for 2024.